When Alan Moore's comic book Watchmen was published, it took the world by surprise. Far from presenting us with a typical superhero story, Moon gave us a very complicated story full of metaphors, recurring symbols, and overlapping plot arcs that managed, in a single comic book, to revolutionize the entire superhero genre and show us the potential of comics as a medium. That is why in this video we will analyze one of the strongest themes within this story. A metaphor developed by Moore between the panels, the plots, and even the title of the comic itself. My name is Go, the Geek Monitor, and today we will analyze the metaphor of time, the clock, and the Watchmaker. We find ourselves in the year 1985. Dr. Jonathan Osterman, better known as Dr. Manhattan, is on Mars. He is 56 years old. He is looking at the stars. It is 1945. Jonathan is sitting in a Brooklyn kitchen, fascinated by the pieces of a clock over a black velvet cloth. Meanwhile, in 1959, he is introduced to a girl named Janie. She buys him a beer. It's the first time anyone has ever done that for him. When she passes him the cold glass, their fingers touch. Examples like this, in which Alan Moore plays with time in a poetic way, are all over this story. And the fact is that, precisely, time, its perception, and the way in which we human beings measure it, that is, through a clock, are the main gears of the great machinery that is Watchmen. Chapter 1. The Clock. The clock is one of the recurring symbols in this comic, which appears throughout the story with various meanings. Here, first of all, we see it in the title Watchmen, which is a play on words that can be translated as the Watchman and the Watchmen. You probably already knew this, but the interesting thing here is that both translations have a useful meaning for the story. The Watchman refers to the phrase quis custodiet ipsus custodes, commonly translated as who watches the watchman, a phrase written by the Latin poet Juvenal. Although originally the phrase referred to the fact that you could not trust another man to take care of your wife, today this phrase speaks to us about the abuse of power and the fact that you cannot give absolute power to any person or institution. This is reflected throughout the story of Watchmen, in the police brutality of the comedian, the apparent absolute power of Dr. Manhattan, and mainly in governments, who can cause the end of the world through nuclear war at the push of a button. This brings me to Alan Moore's use of something known as the Doomsday clock, an apocalypse metaphor, an image we can see throughout the covers of the comic. This clock first appeared in real life in 1947 in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, a magazine created by several members of the Manhattan Project, the project that was in charge of developing the atomic bomb. And yes, fun fact, Dr. Manhattan gets his name from here. The apocalypse clock was created by these scientists with the intention of warning the world about the dangers of their creations, as they felt a social responsibility after their atomic bomb was used on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This clock counts the minutes before midnight, which would supposedly mean global extinction. Over the years, the hands of the clock have been changing, moving closer to or further away from midnight depending on the global situation. In this case, Ozymandias was aware that the end of the world was approaching. He was the only one who could see this clock and decided to do something about it. And it turns out that the watch as a physical object also plays a role within the Watchmen story. Jonathan Osterman was fascinated with clocks as a teenager. Years later, he repaired his girlfriend's watch and then forgot it inside the chamber that gave him his powers. The nuclear bomb metaphorically stopped time in the city of Hiroshima, as we see on the cover of this magazine. Meanwhile, Osterman's dad realized that the clocks were useless, throws the pieces out the window, and forces his son to study atomic physics. Ultimately, Watchmen in a way works like a big clock. It is a story full of synchronized situations, present, past, and future, that moves like machinery. However, it is not only the clock that plays a role in this comic, but also the concept of time itself. Chapter 2. Time. If we want to better understand this chapter, we first have to agree on the definition of time, because it turns out that it has several definitions. Here, first of all, it is the physical magnitude with which we measure the duration and separation of two events, which allows us to have an order in life, that is, a present, a past, and a future. To give an example, first I spent it all working, 15 days later I got paid, and an hour later I spent it all on comics, without caring about a future in which I will die alone. You see, time serves to sort things out and depress us a little bit. It turns out that for many years, various artists and writers have experimented with various ways of representing time in comics, since it's a lot more complicated than it seems. Have you ever wondered how many time passes in a panel like this is? Is it 1 second? 10? 5 minutes? If we look at this panel along with others on the same page, maybe we can get an idea, since we see Rorschach performing various actions, and our mind unconsciously calculates the time it would take us to do them. But it turns out that there are many tricks that artists use to make scenes last as long as the writer wants them to last. For example, panels can be longer. There can be several panels with the same image. We can have panels without borders, etc. However, the most commonly used resource to give time to a comic panel lies in the text. Look at this panel without text. As you can see, it can last as long as you want. Now add a text and the panel at least has to last as long as it would take a person to say this text in a situation similar to this one. Pretty creative, don't you think? It turns out that in the Watchmen comic, Moore uses this device with the difference that he takes it to another level. Since throughout the story, he uses the same text for two completely different situations. Let's take these scenes as an example. Here the text, "Are you prepared to deal with hostilities?" can refer to the Dr. Manhattan interview or to Daniel and Laurie about to confront some criminals. The scene where Rorschach tells the Pagliacci the clown joke overlaps with the scene of the comedian weeping repentantly for his life. But the greatest use of text superimposition comes with Tales of the Black Friar, a pirate comic within the Watchmen comic book that advances in parallel to the same story and joins several scenes thanks to the text. This resource not only gives us the impression of traveling through space, but also through time and through parallel stories. Through the use of words, Moore manages to give us the impression of living the past, the present, and the future at the same time, in the same way as Dr. Manhattan himself. The second concept of time is a little more difficult to understand, but it is important because it turns out that Alan Moore plays with both concepts at the same time in this comic. It turns out that time is also a dimension. And well, what the hell is a dimension? And here to explain it, I'll need the help of my friend, Cartoon Rorschach, who for some strange reason finds himself in a classroom. As we can see, he can move back and forth in the classroom. Sideways, and with the help of a ladder, he could also move up and down. That is, he can move in 3 dimensions, and his position can be represented by coordinates. It turns out that time is the 4th dimension, and although Cartoon Rorschach may not realize it, he is also moving in time. In fact, we all are. The only difference is that we are slaves to time. Since we can't decide where to move, we always move forward, into the future, everyone except Dr. Manhattan. So, if you put the 3 dimensions of space together with the 4th dimension, which is time, you can know the absolute position of anything at any point in time. This is called space-time. Now you can understand why Marty McFly was not thinking in the 4th dimension. Thank you very much for helping me with the explanation, Cartoon Rorschach. Now you can die in peace, so I can explain the last part of this metaphor. Chapter 3. The Watchmaker. If someday you came across a pile of watch parts lying on the floor, you wouldn't be able to reassemble them, since you wouldn't be able to see the order behind all that chaos unless you had the special skills of a watchmaker. Jonathan Osterman's dad was one of them, and although he didn't want his son to become a watchmaker, eventually Dr. Manhattan did become one. with the difference being that he had the ability to find the order behind the chaos of many things, not just clocks. Manhattan is the only character who is not forced to move forward in time. However, his fate is much worse, as he is in all of time at the same time. We can say that he does not move at all. It is as if he is a photograph of himself existing in all parts of his life at the same time. A frozen person. Remember that scene where Manhattan says that there is only one photograph of him? Well, actually here Moore used a photograph as a metaphor for Dr. Manhattan's situation. The comic tells you that Manhattan doesn't change future events like the assassination of John F. Kennedy, because for him, they already happened. Can you imagine then how frustrating it must be for him to see the bars of the cage of time without being able to change its course or do anything to prevent it? If we look closely, in the story we can see how Dr. Manhattan does his best to escape the prison of time on a couple of occasions. For example, when he was annoyed that his partner Janie Slater was aging, Manhattan looked for a younger version to replace her. Unable to move Janie into the past, he sought a substitute with which he unconsciously tried to outwit time. But that's not all. When Manhattan travels to Mars, he doesn't do so simply because he wants to be alone, but because he wants to escape from time itself. In fact, in the comic he says, "I've gone to Mars. I've gone to a place without clocks, without seasons, without hourglasses to trap the shifting pink sand." It's true that Dr. Manhattan is a very powerful character, but power comes with a price. For him to come close to being a god or a clockmaker stripped him of all his humanity. Let's just say that the more he saw the great clockwork machinery of life, the less he cared about people. He didn't care if a comedian killed a pregnant woman in front of him, just as he didn't care if our planet was consumed by nuclear war. It's like seeing our world from space. From Mars, our planet makes sense. It's a sphere floating peacefully in the solar system. The closer you get, the more you realize the beautiful and terrible chaos behind it all. So, if Manhattan and the Watchmaker are an analogy for God, could it be that Moore wants to tell us that the gods are so far away from us that they can't really care about us? Well, as we can see throughout the 12 volumes of the Watchmen comic, Alan Moore functions somewhat like a watchmaker, organizing and arranging events throughout the past, present, and future, in which all the pieces fall into place to form a story of epic proportions. Through a creative use of words, Moore made us live several times at the same time, and through characters like Dr. Manhattan, we come to the realization that not even godlike characters can grasp the immense chaos that is life. For me, the high point of the comic comes with the epiphany that Dr. Manhattan arrives at, in which each of us is a thermodynamic miracle, because the chances of each of us existing here and now are practically impossible. We are as impossible as turning air into gold, and yet, here we are. The world is so full of miracles that sometimes we tend to forget it. As Albert Einstein said after helping to develop the knowledge that made the Manhattan Project possible, that made the atomic bomb possible, that made the Watchmen comic book possible, the unleashing of atomic power has changed everything except the way we think. The solution to this problem lies in the heart of humanity. Had I known this, I would have become a watchmaker.